The river told us everything we needed to know on Tuesday afternoon, July the 22nd, 1873, and none of it was good. I was standing on the bank with my boots already soaked through from a bad step, watching the Gunnison run brown and furious, maybe 40 feet below where it had been 3 days ago. The thunderstorms had come in off the San Juans like they owned the country, which I suppose they did. 2 days of rain, and 1 day of something worse, that low, sky-filling roar that isn't quite thunder, and isn't quite wind, but is both at once. And now the river was this, a brown churning thing, 8 feet above its bed, carrying whole spruce trees past us like they weighed nothing. I'd watched one roll by with its roots still balled in earth, slow and inevitable, and I'd thought, that tree is heavier than anything I've ever lifted in my life, and the river doesn't know it's there. We were at approximately 7,400 feet, somewhere in the valley below the West Elk Breaks, 2 days south of nothing, and 3 days north of nothing else. Saguache was still 4 or 5 days ahead of us on a good crossing. This was not a good crossing. Our packs were 35 pounds each, or had been when we started. The salt pork and hardtack had brought them down some. We'd burned through 5 days of 11 when the rain started, and now I'd counted what was left twice and come to the same number both times. 3 days. Maybe 3.5 if we kept it careful and didn't move much, but we were going to have to move, which meant 3 days was 3 days. I was doing the arithmetic again, the way you do when you already know the answer but keep hoping the numbers will change, when he grabbed my arm. Not hard. He never grabbed hard unless something was actually wrong. This was somewhere in between, which was its own kind of signal. He didn't say anything, he just pointed. About 30 yards downstream, where the flood had scoured the clay bank down to a raw new face, something was sticking out of the mud at an angle. It was iron, rust orange and dark with river silt, but unmistakably iron, curved at the top in a way that I knew the shape of, before I knew why I knew it. A wheel, an iron-banded wheel, half buried, jutting from the clay like the river had been meaning to show it to someone for a long time, and had finally gotten around to it. I looked at him. He was already looking at me. The river was loud enough that we couldn't have talked without shouting, so we didn't. We just started walking toward it, picking our way along the ruined bank, and I remember thinking that whatever that was, it had no business being there. 3 days of food, 1 flooded river. No way forward except through whatever this was. But let me back up 3 days, because the wheel in the bank doesn't mean anything without the 3 days before it. It was a Thursday when the rain started, the 24th of July, 1873. We were at elevation, somewhere north of 8,000 feet by my reckoning, working our way south through the San Juan country toward Saguache. The sky that morning had the particular flat white quality my brother had taught me to distrust, and by midday the first storm came up over the western ridgeline like it had somewhere specific to be. We made camp early, under a granite overhang, and told each other it would break by morning. It didn't break by morning. It didn't break the morning after that either. I want you to understand what our situation actually was, not in the vague way that hardship gets talked about later, but in the specific way it sat on us those 3 days. We had left the trading post at Los Pinos Agency 11 days prior, with 14 days of provisions: salt pork wrapped in oilskin, hardtack in a canvas sack, a twist of coffee, dried apple. By the night the rain started, we had eaten 5 of those days. We had 9 days left in the sack, 2 brothers, and perhaps 60 miles of mountain country between us and Saguache. Our packs ran about 35 pounds each when we loaded them at Los Pinos. My brother carried more of the hardware, the hand axe, the cartridge tin, the iron cookpot, and I carried the food sack and the 2 wool blankets, which meant when the rain started and the blankets took on water, my 35 pounds became something closer to 42. We shared the Sharps carbine on a rotating basis, one of us carrying it slung while the other had a hand free. The Gunnison, where we needed to cross, had been running fast but fordable the week before. A man at Los Pinos had crossed it himself not 10 days prior and said it was running thigh-deep at the shallows east of the canyon, manageable if you kept your feet and didn't rush. That information was worth something on a clear Tuesday. By Friday morning of the storms, after 3 days of continuous rain across the whole drainage, the mountains above us shedding every creek and snowmelt channel at once into that one valley, the river we came down to wasn't the same river he had described. It was loud before we saw it, a low, continuous roar you felt in your back teeth more than you heard it. Brown and churning, running full bank to bank, carrying whole trees. We stood at the edge of it on Friday afternoon, and my brother looked at it for a long time without speaking. When he finally spoke, he said, "We had 3 days of food we could count on, maybe 4 if we cut portions, and that we were not crossing that river." Then he turned and walked us back upstream, and that was when the wheel was there. The wheel stopped him. He'd been walking the bank for maybe 20 minutes, picking his way through the willow scrub upstream, looking for anything. A gravel bar, a narrows, a log jam we could cross on, and finding nothing useful. The river was the same everywhere, brown, fast, indifferent. At one point he waded into the shallows, maybe 4 feet before the current grabbed his boot, and he came back out. He didn't say anything about that. I watched it happen from the bank, and he didn't look back to see if I had. But then he stopped. The iron wheel was sticking out of the bank at a slight angle, still attached to its axle, the lower half buried in clay, the upper half exposed where the flood had cut the bank back and left it hanging. The wood of the wheel was dark and tight-grained, swelled with years of wet, but the iron tire around it was solid. You could see the river had scoured the rust off in patches and left bare metal underneath. He put his boot against the rim and pushed. It didn't move. I came up alongside him, and we both looked at it without speaking for a moment. It was the axle that told us what we were looking at. A single axle meant a wagon, and the iron banding on that wheel, wide, heavy, the kind you put on a working freight rig, meant it wasn't a farm cart or a buckboard. Somewhere behind that axle, buried in the clay of the bank, there was a wagon bed. We spent the better part of an hour on it before the light started going. The flood had cut the bank back overnight and was still working at it. You could hear the clay calving off in chunks every few minutes, small collapses into the current, and as we scraped and pulled at the exposed face of the bank with our hands and the back of the axe, the shape of the thing started coming clear. The full rear end of a Studebaker freight wagon, iron-banded wheels on both sides. The bed canted slightly downstream, where the frame had settled into the clay over what must have been years. The wood of the bed was dark but intact. Whatever had put it here hadn't happened last week. We made camp on the high bank above it. He counted out the salt pork, 4 portions, maybe 5 if we were careful, and set 2 pieces aside for morning without comment. The river noise filled everything, but sitting beside the fire that first night, looking down at the dark shape of that wheel, still catching the last light, I felt something I hadn't felt since we hit the water. We weren't the first ones here. Someone else had come to this exact bend of this exact river, and the country had stopped them too. That fact, by itself, made the night easier to sit through. We went down to it at first light. The bank was steeper than it had looked from above, slick red clay, cut near vertical where the flood had sheared it, and we had to dig footholds with the axe just to get level with the wagon bed. The river was maybe 8 feet out, and still brown, still loud, and every few minutes a section of bank upstream would let go, with a sound like a wet sack dropped hard, and the current would carry it off in pieces. We didn't speak much about what the bank was doing. There was no point. He started on the near wheel, while I worked the upstream end of the bed, scraping clay away from the frame with the axe blade and my fingers. The wood was dark, almost black from the soak, but when I cleared enough away to press my thumb into it, it didn't give. Whatever this wagon had been made of, 2 years in a riverbank hadn't finished it. That surprised me. I remember thinking it shouldn't still be here at all. The chain I found by accident. I'd cleared about a foot of mud from the cross timber near the center of the bed, running my hand along the underside of the planking to feel how far the frame extended, and my fingers hit links. Heavy, cold. Not the light trace chain you'd use for a tailgate. Real weight to it, each link as long as my thumb. I pulled at it, and it didn't give an inch. Bolted fast to the timber. I got down on my elbows in the mud and looked under, and I could see where it went. Straight down into the clay, maybe 18 inches, disappearing around something with corners. Square corners. Not river rock, not timber. Corners that had been made. I called to him. He came around and crouched and looked and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Whatever it is, we dig it out by morning." That was the whole plan. That was the whole of what got said. We worked through the afternoon. The sun hit the canyon wall around 2 o'clock, and the light went flat and gray, and the temperature dropped fast, the way it does up high when the direct sun leaves, and we kept going. My nails were split down to the quick from working at the clay. His knuckles were bleeding from where the axe handle had twisted on a stone. We got the chain exposed, 4 feet of it, 6, anchored to something that wasn't moving. The square shape in the mud was getting clearer under our hands. Corners, flat faces, the suggestion of a hasp. We still had maybe 2.5 days of food. I'd been counting since that morning. He had too, I knew, though neither of us said the number out loud. There are things you don't say when you're both already carrying them. The light died before we finished. We kept going in the dark. There was no question of stopping. Not with the river 2 feet higher than it had been at noon, and the clay still giving up its grip on the chain, 1 careful inch at a time. I couldn't see my hands. I worked by feel. The slick resistance of the mud, the hard edge of whatever was buried in it, the cold of the water that seeped up through the bank every time the current swelled against the outside bend. By 10 o'clock, I had lost sensation to the elbow. Not numbness, something past numbness, something that felt like my arms ended at the wrist, and what remained were 2 instruments I was operating from a distance. He worked beside me without speaking. I could hear him, the measured rhythm of his breathing, the dull, wet sound of clay displaced, the occasional short exhale when the axe found stone. The riverbank trembled. That was the detail I could not stop noticing. Not a shake or a shudder, just a low, continuous trembling, like the ground was conscious of the water pushing through it, and was registering the pressure the only way it could. Every time a surge came through, the whole bank shifted a half inch and settled, and the chain would go taut against whatever it was anchored to below. The smell was extraordinary. 2 years of river clay has a particular smell, mineral and organic and slightly wrong, like meat that has been preserved but not quite right. Rotting wood underneath it, the faint iron smell of the chain, our own sweat and wood smoke from the fire we'd abandoned 2 hours back. Around 3 in the morning, the shape became a certainty. I had both hands flat on it, flat iron faces, true corners, the hasp, a real hasp with a padlock looped through it. The padlock so rusted I could barely fit my fingers around it. I told him what I was feeling. He reached past me and felt it himself, methodically, the way he does, not trusting a description when the thing itself is there to be read. We worked for another hour and a half. The gray came up slow. When it finally pulled free, it came all at once. A sound like a seal breaking on a jar, a sucking release, and then the weight of it dropped into our arms, and we staggered back and sat down in the mud with it between us. 22 pounds of iron, black with cured mud, padlocked, solid. He scraped the lid with the back of the axe head. 3 passes, then 4. The stamped letters came up letter by letter through the mud, as the gray morning light spread across the canyon. HCOE, freight, Saguache, CT. A man's name, a dead man's name, though we didn't know that yet. We just sat there in the mud and looked at it. The light came up the color of pewter off the river. Neither of us moved for a long time. I was aware of my hands, cold, caked to the wrist in gray mud that was already tightening as it dried. I was aware of the box between us, solid and indifferent in the way that iron is, not caring at all that we'd spent the better part of a night pulling it free. I was aware of the river behind us, still loud, still rising by my reckoning, and of the specific gnaw in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the fact that we had 2 days of food left, maybe 3, if we cut the rations mean. He was looking at the letters. I said I want to open it. He didn't answer right away. That's his way. He turns a thing over until every face of it has seen light before he commits to a direction. He picked up the axe and scraped the lid again, slowly, clearing the last of the mud from the stamp. Co, freight, Saguach, CT. He read it the way you'd read a grave marker, careful, like the reading itself was a small act of respect. He said, I want to know who Co is first. I told him Co might be dead. I told him the wagon had been down there for what looked to me like a couple of years at minimum. The wheel iron was eaten deep, the wood we'd felt was soft as cork in places, and nobody leaves a locked freight box chained to a wagon frame in a riverbed on purpose. He listened. He didn't disagree with any of it. But he said, a man's name stamped on a box is still a man's claim on it, dead or living. And if we crack this open in the dark, in the mud, like we're ashamed of what we're doing, that's a different thing than opening it clean. I thought about that. I said, clean how? He said, full daylight, both of us watching, nothing tucked away before the other one sees it. Whatever's inside, we look at it together, and we decide together what it means and what we do with it. That was the line he was drawing, and I understood it. It wasn't about the law. We were a long way from any law. It was about us, about what we were allowed to become out here, where no one was watching. He'd always been like that. He held the line harder when there was nobody around to see him hold it, which is the only kind of holding the line that actually counts. So we waited. We pulled back from the bank and made a small fire with the dry wood we'd cached under the tarp, and we ate a few pieces of hardtack, not much, just enough, and we watched the canyon fill with light from the east, and the box sat between us the whole time, waiting. The light came slow, the way it does at elevation, gray first and then a long amber wash across the canyon walls that turned the river the color of old copper. We hadn't slept much. I don't think either of us had really tried. He picked up the axe. He didn't say anything about it. He just turned the box on its side so the hasp faced up, and he set the cold chisel, the short one we carried for splitting kindling and wedging tent stakes, against the neck of the padlock where the shackle looped through. He looked at me once. I nodded. The first strike rang off the canyon wall and came back to us half a second later, cleaner than the original. I counted. I don't know why I counted, except that it felt like something I was supposed to do, like witnessing, like keeping a record. 1, 2, 3. The metal was old, river-soaked and worked for 2 years by the chemistry of moving water, but it had been a good lock once, and it held longer than I expected. 7, 8. On the 11th strike, the shackle sheared through, and the hasp swung free, and we both just stopped, looked at it. The lock clattered down the bank and into the shallows and was gone. He set the axe down. He lifted the lid. It came up clean, no stuck hinge, no groan of warped metal, and I remember noticing a ring of dark rubber all the way around the interior edge, a gasket, the kind a careful man installs when he means for something to stay dry no matter what. The inside smelled like nothing. Not river, not rot, just dry air, 2 years old, sealed in. There was a leather satchel. That was all. He lifted it out. It was soft with age but intact. Good bridle leather, double-stitched. and he set it on his knee and undid the buckle with both of us watching his hands. Inside, a small sheaf of folded documents, and underneath them, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, a bundle of banknotes held with a length of twine. He counted the notes without a word. I watched his lips. Then he said, $214. I didn't say anything. I was looking at the documents. They were land deeds. A 40-acre parcel, described in careful legal language, Uncompahgre Valley, Ouray County, Colorado Territory. And beneath them, a single letter, handwritten, signed at the bottom, in a forward-leaning script. The signature read, Harlan Co. The letter was short. I read it once, and then I read it again. It was addressed to his daughter. Her name was Mara. He'd written it like he expected to hand it to her himself, not like a man settling accounts, but like a man who planned to be there when she opened it, like a man who didn't know he wasn't going to make it across the river. I read the letter aloud. I am not a fast reader, never was. Our father taught us letters by firelight, with a single almanac and a stick of charcoal, and I always moved slower through words than my brother did, sounding each one out in my mouth before I gave it to the air. So I read it the way I'd learned, careful, halting, one word at a time, with the river loud behind us, and the last of the afternoon light going flat against the clay bank. The letter was dated June 11th, 1871, 3 days before the crossing. He had written it at a desk somewhere. The hand was steady, unhurried, not a man scrambling. A freight contractor, the letter said, operating out of Saguache, Colorado Territory, 3 wagons, 2 drivers, 1 good mule team, and 1 bad one he was always meaning to sell. He had completed a delivery to the Ute agency at Los Pinos and was returning south with an empty wagon and a strongbox, the contents of which he described precisely: land deeds for a 40-acre parcel in the Uncompahgre Valley, a letter of conveyance, and $214 in United States legal tender notes. His operating reserve, the letter called it, which he was carrying rather than leaving with the bank in Saguache, because he did not trust the bank in Saguache. The deeds were for his daughter. Her name appeared twice in the letter, Mara, just Mara, no surname given because she had his surname and he knew it. He wrote that the Gunnison was running high. He knew this. He wrote it plainly, without apology. The river is running high, and I am told it will stay high another week. But the deeds must be recorded at the land office before the July session, or the filing will lapse, and I will not let the filing lapse. He had been waiting 3 days at the north bank already. He had decided to cross in the morning. I stopped there and looked up at my brother. He was staring at the strongbox. I went back to the letter. The last paragraph was short. He wrote that if anything happened to him in the crossing, he trusted whoever found the box to see that Mara got what was hers. He wrote it without drama, the way a practical man calculates odds, not expecting the worst, but not pretending the odds weren't there either. He signed it with that forward-leaning hand. Harlan Co., Freight, Saguache, CT. I folded the letter along its original creases and held it. Somewhere in the crossing, he had chained the box to the wagon frame. That was the part I kept coming back to. Not the drowning, not the river, but that last deliberate act. The chain, the padlock, the click of it closing, making sure the box would stay even when he couldn't. I set the letter down carefully on top of the satchel and didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did Eli. The fire had burned low and the river kept at its noise in the dark beyond the cottonwoods, that constant pushing sound that had been the backdrop to every hour since the flood came through. We slept poorly. In the morning of the second day, I climbed the cut bank at first light and watched the water. It was still the color of red clay, still carrying sticks and foam in long braided lines, but I wasn't certain, only thought, that it had come down some from the night before. I couldn't be sure until mid-afternoon, when I drove a stick into the mud at the waterline and checked it against a notch I'd cut on a cottonwood trunk at the same time I drove it. 2 inches, maybe a hair more, still not crossable, not even close, but moving. My brother came and stood beside me and looked at the stick and the notch. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood there the way he did when he was finishing a calculation. And then he said we would cross at first light on day 3. If the drop continued at the same rate overnight, it would be enough to try a ford at the shallows above the gravel bar. If it hadn't dropped enough, we would cross anyway, because we would have no food left and no reason to wait any longer. He said it plainly. We cross at first light tomorrow, or we don't cross at all. Then he walked back to camp. That night, I sat with the banknotes in my hands. I had spread them out on the wool blanket, all of them, the 10s and the 5s and the worn singles. $214 in paper money, dry as the day they were folded. In the firelight, they looked almost orange. I counted them twice without meaning to. I knew what that sum meant in practical terms. It was resupply in Saguache, twice over. It was new boots for Eli, whose left sole had been stitched 3 times already. It was 6 months of a different kind of hard, instead of this kind. I sat with all of that in my hands and I did not decide anything. I just held the money until holding it started to feel like something it shouldn't, and then I stacked it back into the satchel and folded the flap over and tied the leather cord tight. I looked up. Eli was watching me from across the fire. He hadn't spoken. He just looked at me for a moment in that steady way of his, and then he looked back at the flames. Outside, the river kept falling, slowly, but falling. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, but just settles in while you're still asleep and waits. I woke with frost on the outside of my blanket. The fire was ash. The river sound was different, lower, closer to the rhythm of something that could be crossed, rather than something that would kill you for trying. He was already standing at the bank when I got my boots on. He had the strongbox rope tied to the top of his pack, riding high between his shoulder blades, the hasp facing up. He'd lashed it with 3 passes of hemp cord and a cleat knot I didn't know he knew. He tested the weight of it once, shifting the pack, then left it alone. He looked at the river for a long time without speaking. The bend he'd scouted the afternoon before was maybe 40 yards of channel, wider than it looked, which is always the way, with a gravel bar at the near side and a shallow shelf on the far. The deepest part was the middle third. He waded in first. The sound the current made against his legs was wrong. Too fast, too purposeful. He went into his knee, then his thigh, then, at the first channel, his waist. He kept his feet angled upstream, each step placed before the last one lifted. I watched his shoulders. That's where the effort shows in a man, not his face. At mid-river he stopped. Not fell, stopped, 1 foot slipping on a slick stone, and his whole body rotating half a turn downstream before the other foot found gravel again. It lasted maybe 2-3 seconds. From the bank it felt much longer. I noticed I had stopped breathing. He steadied. He kept going. When he climbed out on the far bank, he turned and looked back at me without expression. I went in. The cold was a separate thing from temperature. It wasn't just cold. It had weight and intention, and it pressed against my chest like a hand. I counted my steps without meaning to. 12 steps to reach the deep channel. The current came up to my ribs. I kept my eyes on the far bank. 12 more seconds across the worst of it. I counted those too, 1 per heartbeat, though my heart wasn't keeping an honest pace. And then the shelf caught under my boots, and the water dropped to my knees, and then my ankles, and then I was on the bank beside him, shaking, standing in the light. He cut the rope from the strongbox without ceremony and set it on a flat stone. Neither of us spoke for a little while. The food we had left was half a strip of salt pork, and 4 crackers of hardtack. Enough for 1 meal. The river was behind us. The box sat between us on the stone, waiting. We ate what we had left sitting on that stone in the afternoon light, the box between us, and didn't talk about what to do next, because there wasn't anything to talk about. He had already decided. I could see it in the way he looked at the stamp on the lid, H. COE, Freight, Saguache, CT. The way his jaw set, the way he didn't reach for the money when we first cracked it open, but instead lifted the leather satchel out first and held it flat in both palms, like something that deserved that kind of care. We weren't going to keep it. He didn't say so. He didn't need to. 7 days to Saguache. We were already a week behind on nothing in particular, but 7 days felt long when you've just crossed a flooded river on a rope and eaten your last hardtack on a rock. We came down out of the San Juans through country that opened up slow, the canyon walls pulling back, the altitude dropping by degrees you could feel in your lungs. On the 4th day, we passed through the Uncompahgre Valley proper, and I remember stopping on a low rise and looking down at a stretch of bottomland that ran along a willow-lined creek, good grass, south-facing, the slope catching the late afternoon in a way that made the whole thing glow. Neither of us knew then what we were looking at. We just stood there a moment, and I thought, somebody ought to build here. Then we kept walking. The land office in Saguache was a low adobe building on the main street, a painted board above the door, a clerk inside, who looked at us the way men looked at us in towns, assessing, deciding we weren't worth worrying about. He changed his mind when my brother set the strongbox on his counter and explained, plainly, what it was and where it had come from. The clerk went through a ledger. He found the name inside of an hour. She was in a boarding house 2 streets over, working as a laundress. She came to the door in her apron, flour-dusted, 19 years old, her hair pinned back from her face. My brother handed her the satchel without preamble. He told her where we found it and how, and who had told us the name. He set the banknotes beside it. $214, still dry, still good. She didn't open the letter from her father right away. She stood at the door holding it, looking at the handwriting on the outside for a long moment. Looking at it the way you look at something you stopped expecting, and then stopped letting yourself expect, and then stopped thinking about entirely. Then she stepped back and asked us inside. We sat in her small room for an hour. She made tea on a tin stove barely bigger than a hat box. My brother took off his hat and held it in his lap, and I watched him be careful with his words, the way he was careful with most things, measuring out what he said, not wasting any of it. She asked a few questions about where exactly the wagon had been, how deep, how the box was chained. She nodded at the answers like she was placing them in a map she'd been building in her head for 2 years. She offered us the land parcel for winter before we'd finished our tea. She said there was a lean-to frame already standing, or had been. She hadn't seen it herself, but a man at the land office had described it when she'd inquired about the property the year before. She said we were welcome to it as long as we needed. She said it quietly, without debt in her voice, which made it easier to accept. We rode out to the Uncompahgre parcel in the first week of October. The lean-to frame was still there, half the roof gone, but the uprights solid. We spent 11 days on it. New crossbeams, split shakes, a stone chimney we built low and tight against the north wall. The first snow came on October 19th. We were inside when it did. We stayed until the middle of March, 1874. 7 months, give or take. The first fixed roof we'd had since our father died. I've thought about it many times since. Not the money. We never thought much about the money. What I've thought about is the chain. Harlan Coe drowned crossing that river in June of 1871. He had time, in those last moments, or maybe the moments just before, to let that box go. It would have been easier. A man fighting a current, a wagon going under. You let go of the things that are pulling you down. He didn't let go. He chained it tighter, is my guess. because it wasn't his to lose. That single stubborn act, 2 years underwater, in 6 inches of river mud, that's what put a roof over two brothers who had none. That's the whole story, in the end. A dead man's refusal to let go of something that belonged to someone else. The high country keeps things. It keeps them longer than people expect, and it gives them back in its own time, to whoever's paying attention. If you're new here, we dig into country like this every week. Old cabins, old names, old decisions made by men long gone. Subscribe if that's the kind of story you want to keep hearing. And if something out there has ever surprised you, the way that riverbank surprised us, tell us about it below. We read every one.